The gunshot that killed Samuel Garrett echoed through the saloon just as Penelope Hayes was pouring his whiskey. And in that terrible moment, her entire world shattered like the glass that slipped from her trembling fingers. It was August 1882 in Valentine, Nebraska, a dusty railroad town where cattle drives met civilization, and trouble brewed as hot as the prairie sun. Penelope had been working at the Silver Spur Saloon for 3 years, ever since her father died and left her with nothing but debts and a tarnished reputation by association. At 22 years old, she had learned to keep her head down, pour drinks with a steady hand, and ignore the wandering eyes of drunken cowboys. But Samuel Garrett had been different. He had been kind to her, respectful even, and when he stumbled into the saloon that scorching evening with blood on his hands and terror in his eyes, she made a choice that would change everything. Samuel had grabbed her wrist, his fingers sticky with red, and gasped out words that made no sense at the time. "They will blame you too," he said, his face pale as moonlight. "The money, it is in the old Henderson place, under the floorboards where the stove used to be. I never meant for any of this." Then came the shot, fired from the doorway by a man Penelope recognized as Deputy Frank Morrison, and Samuel collapsed against the bar, sliding down to leave a crimson streak on the polished wood. Everything happened so fast after that. More men poured into the saloon, their boots thundering on the wooden floor. Sheriff Coleman pushed through the crowd, his silver badge catching the lamplight. He was a hard man with a harder reputation, and his eyes swept the scene with cold calculation. When his gaze landed on Penelope, still standing frozen behind the bar with Samuel's blood spattering her white apron, something shifted in his expression. "She was talking to him," Deputy Morrison said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Right before I came in. Saw them through the window, looking real friendly-like." Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. "I was just serving him a drink. I did not know anything about whatever he did." Sheriff Coleman walked slowly toward the bar, his spurs jingling with each step. He crouched beside Samuel's body, checking for signs of life even though everyone could see there were none. "Samuel Garrett robbed the bank this afternoon," he said, his voice measured and deliberate. "Killed the bank manager, old Thomas Whitmore. Shot him in cold blood and made off with nearly $10,000. He stood up, his eyes never leaving Penelope's face. "Now that money is nowhere to be found on his person, and my deputy here says you two were having quite the conversation." "No," Penelope said, hearing the desperation creep into her voice. "I mean, yes, we were talking, but he did not tell me anything about any robbery. I would never—" "Thomas Whitmore was a good man," Sheriff Coleman interrupted. "Had a wife, 3 children. Now they have got nothing because of scum like this." He nudged Samuel's body with his boot. "And I am thinking maybe he had help. Maybe someone who works in a place like this, who knows how to keep secrets and look innocent while doing it." The crowd murmured, and Penelope felt the weight of their suspicion pressing down on her like a physical thing. She had lived in Valentine long enough to know how this worked. The sheriff needed someone to blame, needed to show the town that justice was swift and certain. Samuel was already dead, but that was not enough. They wanted the money back, and they wanted someone to pay for Thomas Whitmore's murder. "I did not do anything," she said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "We will see about that," Sheriff Coleman said. "Frank, take her to the jail. We will sort this out proper in the morning." Deputy Morrison moved around the bar, and Penelope stumbled backward, her mind racing. She thought about Samuel's last words about the money hidden in the Henderson place. If she told them, would they believe she was innocent? Or would it just confirm their suspicions that she was involved? The old Henderson homestead was 3 miles outside of town, abandoned for years. How would she even know about such a hiding place unless she was part of the plan? "Please," she said as Morrison reached for her arm. "I am telling you the truth. I had nothing to do with any robbery." But Morrison's grip was iron hard, and he pulled her out from behind the bar. The crowd parted as he dragged her toward the door, and Penelope saw the faces of people she had served drinks to for years. People who had smiled at her and left her tips and treated her like she was part of the town's fabric. Now those same faces looked at her with suspicion and disgust, already convinced of her guilt. The jail was a small building next to the sheriff's office, with 2 cells separated by iron bars. Morrison shoved her into one and locked the door with a loud clang that seemed to seal her fate. "Best get comfortable," he said with a cruel smile. "Sheriff is bringing Judge Hawthorne in from North Platte. Should be here by first light, and then we will have ourselves a trial." After he left, Penelope sank onto the narrow cot and tried to think. Judge Hawthorne was known for his harsh sentences and his unwillingness to tolerate criminals. With Samuel dead and unable to defend her, with the deputy's testimony and her own presence at the scene, she knew exactly how this would go. They would convict her as an accomplice to robbery and murder, and she would hang. Maybe not immediately, but soon enough. The thought made her stomach turn and her hands shake. She had to get out, had to run. But the cell door was solid and there was a guard posted outside. Through the small barred window, she could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. First light was perhaps 8 hours away. 8 hours until Judge Hawthorne arrived and her life effectively ended. Penelope pressed her face against the cool iron bars and let herself cry, something she had not allowed herself to do in years. She cried for the unfairness of it all, for her father who had left her alone in this harsh world, for Samuel Garrett who had dragged her into his mess with his dying words, and for herself, for the life she would never get to live. She was still crying when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside, followed by a low voice speaking to the guard. "Sheriff sent me to relieve you," the voice said. "Said you should go help with the body and the investigation." "Nobody told me about that," the guard replied, sounding uncertain. "Well, I am telling you now. You want to question the sheriff's orders." There was a pause, then the sound of the guard's footsteps moving away. Penelope wiped her eyes and stood up, pressing herself against the bars to try to see who had arrived. A moment later, a man appeared in the doorway of the jail, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight from the street. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, and Penelope recognized the voice even before he stepped into the dim light of the jail's single lantern. Lucas Emerson, a ranch hand from the Double E spread west of town. She had served him drinks a handful of times, had noticed him because he was different from the other cowboys. Quieter, more thoughtful, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and green eyes that seemed to see more than most people. He was probably around 26 or 27, lean and strong in the way of men who spent their days working cattle under the Nebraska sun. "What are you doing?" Penelope whispered, confused and suddenly afraid for an entirely different reason. If he was caught helping her, he would be arrested too. Lucas pulled a key ring from his pocket, and Penelope realized with a shock that he must have taken it from the guard somehow. "The posse is coming for you at first light," he said, his voice urgent and low. "Judge Hawthorne is not just coming to try you. Sheriff Coleman already has a dozen men ready to ride out and search for that money, and they figure the fastest way to find it is to make you talk. I heard them planning it at the general store. They are not planning on waiting for any trial." Penelope's blood ran cold. She understood what he was saying. They would torture her for information, and when she could not tell them what she did not know, they would kill her anyway. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as Lucas tried different keys in the lock. "Because I was there tonight," he said. "I was in the back corner of the saloon when Samuel came in, and I saw the whole thing. I saw him grab you, saw the panic in your face. You did not know what he was going to say, and you sure as hell did not know about any robbery." The lock clicked open, and Lucas pulled the cell door wide. "Now come on. We do not have much time before that guard realizes I tricked him." Penelope hesitated for just a heartbeat, torn between the ingrained instinct to follow rules and the overwhelming need to survive. Then she stepped out of the cell and into Lucas Emerson's orbit, trusting a man she barely knew because she had no other choice. They moved quickly through the back door of the jail, into the alley that ran between the buildings. The town was still busy with people discussing the robbery and murder, which meant the streets were too dangerous. Lucas led her through the shadows, keeping to the edges of buildings, his hand warm and solid around hers. They reached the livery stable from the backside, and Lucas held up a hand for her to wait while he checked inside. A moment later, he returned leading 2 horses, already saddled. "I prepared them earlier," he explained quietly, "after I heard what the sheriff was planning. Figured you would need a way out." Penelope stared at him in the darkness. "You planned this. You could go to prison. You could be hanged for helping me." Lucas met her eyes, and even in the dim starlight she could see the determination in his face. "I could not stand by and let them kill an innocent woman," he said simply. "Now get on the horse. We need to be miles from here before anyone notices you are gone." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to save himself, but the sound of voices from the main street reminded her that time was a luxury she did not have. Penelope put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the horse, grateful that her father had at least taught her to ride before he died. Lucas mounted his own horse with the easy grace of someone who had spent half his life in the saddle. They rode out of Valentine under the cover of darkness, heading west into the open prairie. The moon was just a sliver, which made it harder to see but also harder to be seen. Lucas set a fast pace, and Penelope focused on keeping her seat and following his lead. The night air was cooler than the scorching day had been, but it still carried the dry heat that defined Nebraska summers. They rode for what felt like hours, the landscape gradually changing from the flat grasslands near town to more rolling hills. Penelope's thighs burned and her hands ached from gripping the reins, but she did not complain. Behind them, Valentine was disappearing into the darkness, and with it, the life she had known. Finally, Lucas slowed his horse to a walk and then stopped beside a small creek that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees. "We will rest here for a bit," he said, dismounting. "Let the horses drink." Penelope slid off her horse, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. Lucas caught her elbow, steadying her. "You all right?" he asked, concern in his voice. "Yes," she said, though she was far from all right. Everything was catching up with her now, the fear and shock and exhaustion. "I just need a minute." Lucas led the horses to the water and then returned to where Penelope had sunk down onto the creek bank. He sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the gentle burble of the creek and the horses splashing in the shallows. "Thank you," Penelope finally said. "I know that is not enough, but I do not know what else to say. You saved my life tonight." "You do not need to thank me," Lucas replied. He picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in his hands. "I just did what was right." "Most people would not have," Penelope said quietly. "Most people would have believed I was guilty, just like the sheriff did." Lucas tossed the stone into the creek, and they watched the ripples spread out in the moonlight. "My father was accused of something he did not do," he said after a moment. "Back in Missouri when I was 14. Someone stole horses from a ranch where he worked, And because my father was new and because he was Irish, they decided he must have done it. They did not bother with a trial or evidence. They just formed a mob and came for him one night. Penelope turned to look at Lucas, seeing the pain in his profile. "What happened?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "My mother hid me in the root cellar," Lucas said, his voice flat in the way of someone recounting an old wound. "I heard everything. Heard them drag him out, heard my mother screaming, heard the horses ride away. By the time I came out, he was hanging from the old oak tree in our yard." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. 3 months later, they caught the real horse thieves, 2 drifters from Kansas. But my father was still dead, and nobody apologized or tried to make it right. They just moved on like it never happened. "I am so sorry," Penelope said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. She understood now why Lucas had helped her, why he had risked everything. He knew what it was like to watch injustice unfold and be powerless to stop it. "That is why I left Missouri," Lucas said. "Could not stay in a place with that much blood on it. Came out here to Nebraska 5 years ago, been working ranches ever since." He turned to look at her finally, and in his eyes, she saw not pity but understanding. "When I saw what was happening to you tonight, I knew I could not let it play out the same way, not if I could do something about it." Penelope felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer night. This man, who barely knew her, had thrown away his own safety and future to give her a chance. It was the most selfless thing anyone had ever done for her. "Where do we go now?" she asked. "They will search for us. Sheriff Coleman will not let this go." Lucas stood up and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. "There is a town called Ogallala about 80 miles southwest of here," he said. "Big cattle town on the Platte River. We can get lost there for a while, maybe find work, figure out our next move. But we need to keep moving. They will realize you are gone soon, and once the sun comes up, they will be able to track us." They mounted up again and continued west, riding through the remainder of the night. Penelope's body moved in rhythm with the horse, her mind drifting between alertness and exhaustion. She kept glancing at Lucas, at the strong line of his shoulders and the confident way he sat his horse. He had given up everything for her, for a stranger he barely knew. The weight of that sacrifice pressed on her heart. Dawn began to break across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The landscape was beautiful in the early light, all rolling grassland and endless horizon. But beauty meant visibility, and visibility meant danger. "There," Lucas said, pointing toward a rocky outcropping in the distance. "We can take shelter there during the day, let the horses rest. Travel again tonight." They reached the rocks just as the sun cleared the horizon, bathing the prairie in harsh morning light. The outcropping formed a small cave, barely big enough for 2 people, but it provided shade and concealment. Lucas tended to the horses first, removing their saddles and hobbling them so they could graze on the sparse grass nearby. Penelope sank down onto the sandy floor of the cave, her back against the cool rock. Every muscle in her body ached, and her mind felt fuzzy from lack of sleep. Lucas settled beside her, pulling a canteen from his saddle bag and offering it to her first. "Drink slow," he advised. "We need to make the water last until we reach the Platte." Penelope took small sips, the water soothing her parched throat. She handed the canteen back to Lucas and watched as he drank. In the growing daylight, she could see him more clearly now. He had a strong jaw covered with a day's worth of dark stubble, a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once, and those green eyes that seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to understand. There was a scar on his left eyebrow, barely visible, and his hands were calloused and strong. "You should try to sleep," Lucas said, capping the canteen. "I will keep watch." You need sleep too, Penelope protested. I will sleep later, he said. Right now, keeping you safe is more important. There it was again, that selflessness that seemed to define him. Penelope felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough for one night. Lucas, she said softly, what you did, leaving everything behind, it was not just about your father, was it? You had a life in Valentine, a job. What about the ranch you worked for? Lucas leaned his head back against the rock and closed his eyes for a moment. The Double E was a good place to work, he admitted, but it was not home. I have been drifting since I left Missouri, never really putting down roots anywhere. Maybe part of me knew I would have to run again someday. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Or maybe I was just waiting for a reason to stop drifting. The air between them suddenly felt charged with something Penelope could not quite name. She was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his gaze seemed to see straight into her soul. You do not even know me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could be a terrible person, I could actually be guilty. No, Lucas said firmly, you are not. I can see it in you, Penelope, the goodness, the strength. You have been surviving in that saloon, dealing with drunk cowboys and wandering hands, keeping yourself together after losing your father. That takes courage. He paused, then added, and you can call me Luke. Lucas always sounds too formal. Luke, Penelope repeated, tasting the name. It fit him somehow, strong and simple. My friends used to call me Penny back before everything fell apart. Penny, Luke said, and the way he said it made her name sound like something precious. Try to get some sleep, Penny. We have a long road ahead of us. She wanted to stay awake, to keep talking to him, to understand more about this man who had turned her world upside down in the best possible way. But exhaustion won out, and her eyes drifted closed. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was the gentle weight of Luke's coat settling over her shoulders. When Penelope woke, the sun was high overhead and the cave was stifling with heat. She sat up groggily, pushing Luke's coat aside, and looked around. Luke was sitting at the mouth of the cave, his back to her as he kept watch over the prairie. The horses were still grazing peacefully, which she took as a good sign. How long did I sleep? She asked, her voice rough. Luke turned and she saw the exhaustion in his face. Few hours, he said. It is about noon now. You should drink some more water. Penelope crawled over to where he sat and took the canteen he offered. As she drank, she studied the landscape beyond the cave. The prairie stretched out in all directions, seemingly endless. Have you seen anyone? She asked. No, Luke said. But that does not mean they are not out there. Sheriff Coleman is persistent and he has good trackers. He rubbed his eyes. We will wait until evening, then ride through the night again. With luck, we will reach Ogallala tomorrow. You need to sleep, Penelope insisted. I can keep watch now. Luke looked like he wanted to argue, but his body betrayed him with a jaw-cracking yawn. All right, he conceded, but wake me if you see anything. Anything at all. He moved deeper into the cave, into the coolest part, and stretched out on the sandy floor. Within minutes, his breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Penelope took up the watch position, her eyes scanning the horizon. The hours passed slowly in the heat of the afternoon. Penelope's thoughts churned, replaying everything that had happened. Samuel Garrett's murder, her arrest, Luke's rescue. It all felt surreal, like something from a dime novel rather than her real life. Just yesterday morning, her biggest concern had been whether she would earn enough in tips to fix the hole in her boot. Now she was a fugitive, running across the Nebraska prairie with a cowboy she barely knew, except that was not entirely true anymore. She did know Luke, or at least she was beginning to. She knew he was brave and kind and willing to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. She knew he carried the weight of his father's death like a stone in his heart. She knew the sound of his voice in the darkness and the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She was falling for him. Maybe it had been since the moment he opened that cell door. It was foolish and impractical and probably dangerous given their circumstances, but her heart did not seem to care about any of that. Luke Emerson had risked his life for her, and somewhere in the chaos and fear, something had taken root between them. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Luke stirred. He sat up, running his hands through his dark hair. "Anything?" he asked. "Nothing," Penelope reported. "It has been quiet." Luke came to sit beside her and they watched the sunset together. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder that the world kept turning regardless of their troubles. "Tell me about yourself," Luke said quietly. "Your life before all this." Penelope drew her knees up to her chest. "There is not much to tell," she said. "My father was a farmer, had a small place outside of Valentine. My mother died when I was young, some kind of fever. It was just me and my father for years. He taught me to read and ride, told me stories about when he was young." She smiled sadly at the memories. "But he was not very good at farming. Too optimistic, I think. Always believed next year would be better, that the rains would come or the prices would rise. They never did." "When did you lose him?" Luke asked gently. 3 years ago, Penelope said. "He got sick that winter, pneumonia, died in February. The bank took the farm for the debts and I had nothing. Mrs. Calloway at the saloon gave me a job out of pity, I think. She knew my mother years ago. Working in a saloon could not have been easy," Luke observed. Penelope laughed bitterly. "You have no idea. The men, they think because you serve them drinks, you are available for other things too. I learned to dodge hands and smile through insults, to pour whiskey with one hand while keeping a knife in reach with the other." She looked at Luke. "But I survived. I always survive." "You are stronger than you know," Luke said, and the admiration in his voice made her cheeks flush. "What about you?" Penelope asked. "What did you dream about before everything happened with your father?" Luke considered the question. "I wanted to have my own ranch someday," he said. "Nothing huge, just enough land for some cattle and horses. A house with a porch where you could sit in the evening and watch the sun go down. Maybe a family." He glanced at her. "Seems like a foolish dream now." "It is not foolish," Penelope said firmly. "It is a good dream." They fell silent as the last light faded from the sky. Luke stood and began saddling the horses. "Time to move," he said. They rode through the night again, following the stars west and south. The prairie was alive with night sounds, crickets and coyotes and the whisper of wind through the grass. Penelope's body was adjusting to the constant riding, finding the rhythm more easily now. She kept pace with Luke, the two of them moving through the darkness like ghosts. Around midnight, they stopped at a small stream to water the horses and refill their canteen. Luke had shot a rabbit earlier in the evening, and they took the time to build a small fire and cook it. The meat was tough and gamey, but it was food, and Penelope's stomach had been empty for too long. As they ate, Luke told her stories about working cattle drives, about stampedes and river crossings and nights under the stars. Penelope found herself laughing at some of his tales, the sound strange and foreign after so much fear and tension. Luke's face lit up when she laughed, and he seemed to try harder to amuse her, to bring that sound out again. "There was this one time," he said, his eyes dancing with mirth, "when we were driving a herd up to Dodge City. One of the cowboys, fellow named Pete, he decided he was going to impress everyone by riding this half-wild Mustang. Well, that horse took off like the devil himself was chasing it, and Pete was hanging on for dear life, yelling the whole way. Luke chuckled. That Mustang ran straight through the camp, knocked over the chuck wagon, scattered the remuda, and finally threw Pete right into the boss's tent, landing on top of the boss while he was sleeping. Penelope giggled despite herself. What happened to Pete? Boss gave him every terrible job for the rest of the drive, Luke said. But Pete earned the nickname Flying Pete, and he still works the circuit as far as I know, telling that story to anyone who will listen. They finished eating and kicked dirt over the fire. As Luke helped Penelope back onto her horse, his hands lingered on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Penelope knew he felt it too, this connection growing between them. They rode on through the night, and as dawn approached, Luke pointed to a dark line on the horizon. "That is the Platte River," he said. "Ogallala is just beyond it. We made good time." Relief flooded through Penelope. They had made it. They had ridden nearly 80 miles in just over a day and a half, and somehow they had avoided the Posse. As the sun rose, they could see Ogallala spread out before them, a thriving cattle town much larger than Valentine. The streets were already busy with cowboys and cattle, the air thick with dust and the smell of livestock. Luke led them to a boarding house on the quieter edge of town. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, asked no questions when Luke paid for 2 rooms with some of the money he had brought from Valentine. Penelope nearly wept with gratitude when she saw the room with its real bed and wash basin. "Rest today," Luke said from her doorway. "Tonight we will figure out our next steps." But before he could leave, Penelope crossed the room and took his hand. "Luke," she said, looking up into his tired, beautiful face. "I know I said it before, but thank you for everything, for believing in me, for saving me, for bringing me here." Luke's hand tightened around hers. "Penny," he said softly, and her name on his lips sent shivers through her. "I need you to know something. I did not just help you because it was the right thing to do. I mean it was, but that is not the only reason." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "When I saw you in that jail, so scared but still standing tall, still fighting, something in me just knew. Knew that you were special, that you were worth saving, that maybe you were the reason I had been drifting all these years." Penelope's heart hammered in her chest. "Luke, we have only known each other for 2 days. I know," he said. "I know it is crazy and fast and probably foolish, but out here in this life you learn to trust your instincts, and every instinct I have is telling me that you are important, that we are important." She wanted to kiss him. The desire was so strong it nearly overwhelmed her, but she was filthy from days of riding, exhausted and emotionally wrung out. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "Get some rest. We will talk more later." Luke nodded and reluctantly let go of her hand. After he left, Penelope washed as best she could with the water in the basin, then collapsed onto the bed. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless. When she woke, the light slanting through the window suggested it was late afternoon. Someone had left a tray outside her door with bread, cheese, and apples. Penelope ate ravenously, then washed more thoroughly and tried to make herself presentable. Her dress was ruined, stained with dirt and sweat, but it was all she had. A knock on the door made her jump. "It is me," came Luke's voice. She opened the door to find him looking much better after rest and washing. He had shaved, and his dark hair was damp and combed back from his forehead. He held a package wrapped in brown paper. "I went to the general store," he said, handing her the package. "Figured you could use some new clothes." Penelope unwrapped it to find a simple but clean dress in blue calico, along with undergarments and a pair of sturdy boots. Tears pricked her eyes at his thoughtfulness. "Luke, you have already spent so much money on me." "It is just money," he said with a shrug. You needed clothes. Besides, I sold my saddle. It was too fancy, too recognizable. Got a plain one instead and had enough left over for supplies. Penelope set the clothes aside and impulsively hugged him. Luke stiffened in surprise for just a moment, then his arms came around her, pulling her close. He was warm and solid, and she could hear his heartbeat beneath her ear. They stood like that for a long moment, neither wanting to let go. Finally, Luke cleared his throat and stepped back, though his hands lingered on her shoulders. "Get changed," he said, his voice rough. "Then come down to the dining room. We need to talk about what comes next." Penelope changed into the new dress, marveling at how much better it felt to be clean and in fresh clothes. The dress fit well enough, and the boots were comfortable. She braided her long brown hair and pinned it up, then made her way downstairs. Luke was waiting at a corner table, and his eyes widened when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, standing up as she approached. Penelope blushed. "Thank you, and thank you for the clothes." They sat down, and Luke ordered dinner for both of them. As they waited for the food, he leaned forward, his expression serious. "I have been asking around town," he said quietly, carefully, not using our real names. "Word is that Sheriff Coleman did send out a posse, but they headed north toward Dakota Territory, figuring we would run toward the Black Hills. They have not looked this direction yet." "Yet," Penelope repeated, "but they will." "Eventually," Luke agreed, "which is why we need to decide what to do. We can keep running, head further west to Colorado or Wyoming. Or we can stay here for a while, find work, try to build new lives under different names." Penelope considered both options. Running meant safety, but also meant always looking over their shoulders, never settling down. Staying meant risk, but also meant the possibility of actually living rather than just surviving. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Luke met her eyes. "Honest answer, I want to stay. I want to find work at one of the ranches around here, save up money. I want to spend time with you, get to know you properly, see where this thing between us goes." He paused. "But I will not make that choice for you. If you want to keep running, we run. Whatever you need, Penny, that is what we will do." The sincerity in his voice, the way he put her needs ahead of his own wants, made Penelope's decision easy. "Let us stay," she said, "at least for a while, try to build something here." Relief and happiness flooded Luke's face. "Yeah," he said, grinning. "Yeah," Penelope confirmed, smiling back at him. Their dinner arrived, and they ate while making plans. Luke had already inquired at a few ranches and had promising leads for work. Penelope could find employment in town, maybe at a restaurant or a boarding house, something respectable that would not draw the wrong kind of attention. They would use false names. Lucas would become Luke Emmett, and Penelope would be Penny Harper. Over the next few weeks, they settled into life in Ogallala. Luke got hired on at the Triple Creek Ranch, working long days with cattle but earning steady pay. Penelope found work at a respectable restaurant called the Cattleman's Rest, serving food rather than liquor, which suited her much better. They kept separate rooms at the boarding house to maintain propriety, but they spent their free time together, and everyone in town assumed they were courting, which Penelope supposed they were. Luke was unfailingly respectful, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but his feelings were clear in every look, every gentle touch, every word, and her own feelings grew stronger with each passing day. She loved the way he made her laugh, the way he listened when she talked, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One evening in late September, after they had been in Ogallala for nearly 6 weeks, Luke took her for a walk along the Platte River. The cottonwoods were starting to turn gold, and the air had the crisp edge of approaching autumn. They walked hand in hand, comfortable in each other's presence. "Penny," Luke said, stopping near a spot where the river curved around a sandbar. "I have been thinking a lot lately. About us, about the future." Penelope's heart sped up. "What about it?" Luke turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know our circumstances are not ideal. We are living under false names, always with that shadow of the past hanging over us. But these weeks with you, they have been the happiest of my life." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Penny. I think I have loved you since that night I opened your cell door, maybe even before. And I know it is fast, and I know we have only known each other a couple of months, but out here, time moves different. When you find something real, you hold on to it." Tears streamed down Penelope's cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I have been so scared to say it, scared that admitting it would somehow jinx us. But I do, Luke. I love you with everything I am." Luke pulled her into his arms and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, and it was everything Penelope had dreamed it would be. His lips were soft and warm, and the kiss started gentle but deepened as passion took over. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Marry me," Luke said, his forehead resting against hers. "I know we cannot use our real names, but marry me anyway. Be my wife, Penny. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Penelope said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married a week later by a justice of the peace in Ogallala, standing before witnesses they barely knew, using names that were not their own. But the vows they spoke were real, and the rings Luke bought were real, and the love between them was the most real thing Penelope had ever felt. Their wedding night was spent in a small house Luke had rented on the edge of town, a little place with 2 rooms and a porch. It was not much, but it was theirs. Luke carried her over the threshold, and they made love for the first time with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's hearts. Afterward, lying in Luke's arms in their bed, Penelope felt a peace she had never known. "I never thought I could be this happy," she murmured against his chest. Luke kissed the top of her head. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "We are going to build a good life here, Penny, a real life." And for a while they did. Luke continued working at the Triple Creek Ranch, and Penelope kept her job at the restaurant. They saved their money carefully, dreaming of the day they could buy their own piece of land. Their little house became a home, filled with laughter and love. Luke would come home dusty and tired from working cattle, and Penelope would have dinner ready. They would eat together on the porch, watching the sunset, talking about their days and their dreams. Penelope made friends in town, other women who worked respectable jobs and welcomed her into their circles. Luke became respected among the ranch hands for his hard work and skill with horses. They were building the life they had hoped for, brick by brick, day by day. But the past, as it always does, eventually caught up with them. It was a cold day in November, nearly 4 months after they had fled Valentine, when Luke came home early from the ranch with trouble written all across his face. Penelope was kneading bread dough and looked up in alarm when he burst through the door. "We have to leave," Luke said without preamble. "Now, pack only what you can carry on a horse." Penelope's hands stilled in the dough. "What happened?" "A couple of cowboys rode into the Triple Creek today from Valentine," Luke said, already moving through the house gathering supplies. "They were talking about the robbery and murder back in August, how Sheriff Coleman is still looking for you. They had a description that was close enough to make me nervous. I do not think they recognized me, but it is only a matter of time." Fear, which had been dormant for months, surged back to life. "Where will we go?" "Colorado," Luke said. "Maybe Wyoming. Somewhere far enough that Valentine seems like another world." He stopped and came to her, cupping her face in his hands. "I am sorry, Penny. I know we were happy here. I know this is not fair." Penelope covered his hands with her own. "Fair or not, we are in this together," she said firmly. "Let me pack." Within an hour they were on horses, riding west out of Ogallala. It hurt to leave, to abandon the little house and the life they had been building. But Penelope held tight to what mattered most. Luke was beside her, and they were together. They rode hard for several days, pushing deeper into Nebraska and then crossing into Colorado territory. The landscape changed from prairie to high plains to foothills. The weather grew colder as they climbed in elevation, and snow began to dust the peaks of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. In a small mining town called Silver Creek, they stopped to rest and resupply. The town was rough and filled with prospectors and drifters, the kind of place where people did not ask too many questions. Luke found work at a livery stable, and Penelope took in laundry. It was hard, back-breaking work, but it kept them fed and housed through the winter. That winter was long and brutal, with snow piling high and temperatures that could kill an unprepared person. But in their small rented room above a feed store, Luke and Penelope found warmth in each other. They talked for hours, sharing stories and dreams. Luke taught Penelope to play poker with a worn deck of cards. Penelope taught Luke to cook more than just beans and bacon. They made love and laughed and held each other through the long nights. One evening in February, as a blizzard howled outside, Penelope realized she had not had her monthly courses in a while. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt, and she sat very still, her hand drifting to her still flat stomach. "Luke," she said quietly, "I think I might be with child." Luke, who had been whittling a piece of wood by the stove, looked up sharply. "You think," he said, his voice careful. "I am late," Penelope said. "Very late, and I have been feeling sick in the mornings." Luke set down his whittling and came to kneel in front of her chair. He placed his hands over hers on her stomach, and his eyes were bright with emotion. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby. It looks that way," Penelope said, and then she started crying, overwhelmed by all of it. Luke gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "Hey," he said gently, "this is good news. Amazing news. We are going to be a family." "But we are still running," Penelope sobbed, "still hiding. What kind of life is this to bring a child into?" "It is the life we have," Luke said firmly, "and we will make it the best life we can. This baby will be loved and safe and wanted. That is what matters." Over the following months, as spring came to the mountains and Penelope's belly grew round, Luke became even more protective and devoted. He took extra work to save money for the baby, and he made a cradle with his own hands, carving little horses into the wood. Penelope sewed tiny clothes and tried not to worry about the future. The baby came on a warm day in late June, with the help of a midwife from town. It was a boy, perfect and healthy, with a strong cry and a tuft of dark hair like his father. They named him Thomas, after the bank manager whose death had inadvertently set all of this in motion. It felt right somehow, to honor an innocent victim. Luke wept when he held his son for the first time, and Penelope fell in love all over again watching her husband cradle their baby with such tenderness. "He is perfect," Luke whispered. "You are amazing, Penny. Thank you for this gift." Being parents changed them in ways both exhausting and wonderful. Thomas was a demanding baby, but he was also the light of their lives. Luke would come home from the livery covered in dust and horse smell, and his face would transform into pure joy at the sight of his son. Penelope, despite her exhaustion, felt a completeness she had never imagined possible, but the shadow of the past still loomed. They lived in constant awareness that they were fugitives, that discovery could come at any moment. Luke kept a saddled horse ready at all times, and they had a plan for what to do if they had to run again. That moment came when Thomas was 8 months old. Luke came home pale and shaking, and Penelope knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. "What is it?" she asked, holding Thomas close. "Sheriff Coleman is in town," Luke said. "I saw him in the general store. He is asking about a couple matching our description, a man and woman who might have had a baby recently." Penelope felt like the ground had dropped out from under her. After more than a year, Coleman was still hunting them. "How did he find us?" "I do not know," Luke said, "but we cannot wait to find out. We have to leave tonight." They packed by lamplight, taking only essentials. Thomas, sensing the tension, fussed and cried. Penelope soothed him while Luke loaded their belongings onto the horses. They had saved a fair amount of money, which Luke had kept hidden for exactly this kind of emergency. Just before midnight, they rode out of Silver Creek, heading north into Wyoming territory. Thomas was bundled against the cold, sleeping against Penelope's chest in a sling Luke had made. The moon was bright, lighting their way as they climbed higher into the mountains. They traveled for weeks, moving from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to establish roots. Luke found odd jobs, and Penelope did whatever work she could that allowed her to keep Thomas with her. It was a hard, nomadic existence, but they had each other, and that sustained them. In a town called Laramie, Luke finally said what they had both been thinking. "We cannot keep running forever," he said one night after Thomas had finally fallen asleep. "This is no life for him, always moving, never having a real home. We need a permanent solution." "What kind of solution?" Penelope asked, though part of her already knew what he was going to say. "I need to go back," Luke said. "Back to Valentine. Find out if there is any evidence that could clear your name. Maybe find that money Samuel hid, turn it in, show that we were never part of the robbery." "That is insane," Penelope said immediately. "They will arrest you the moment you set foot in town, or worse." "Maybe," Luke conceded. "But what choice do we have? We can either spend the rest of our lives running, or we can try to fix this. And I will not, let our son grow up always hiding, always afraid." They argued about it for days, but in the end, Penelope knew Luke was right. This was not sustainable. Thomas deserved better, deserved a real home and a real life. "If you are going back, I am coming with you," Penelope said firmly. "Absolutely not," Luke replied. "It is too dangerous for you." "We are a family," Penelope insisted. "We face this together." They compromised. Luke would go back first, alone, to scout the situation and search for the hidden money. If he found evidence that could help, he would send word. Penelope and Thomas would wait in Laramie with a friend they had made, a woman named Sarah who ran a boarding house and had taken a liking to them. The day Luke left was one of the hardest of Penelope's life. She held him tight, breathing in his scent, trying to memorize every detail of his face. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Promise you will come back." "I promise," Luke said, kissing her deeply. Then he knelt and kissed Thomas's forehead. "Take care of your mama, little man. I will be home soon." Penelope watched him ride away until he was just a speck on the horizon, and then she went inside and cried until she had no tears left. The weeks that followed were torture. Every day without word from Luke felt like a year. Penelope tried to stay busy, helping Sarah with the boarding house and caring for Thomas, but her mind was always in Nebraska, wondering if Luke was safe, if he had been caught, if she would ever see him again. Then, 6 weeks after Luke had left, Sarah came running with a telegram. Penelope's hands shook as she opened it, found the money. "Have proof, bringing it to you, wait there. Love always, L." Relief and joy flooded through Penelope so intensely she nearly collapsed. He was alive. He had found the evidence, and he was coming back. Luke arrived in Laramie 3 days later, and Penelope flew into his arms with such force she nearly knocked him over. They held each other for a long time, Thomas squished between them, gurgling happily to have his father back. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Luke told Penelope everything. He had snuck into Valentine under cover of darkness and made his way to the old Henderson place. The house was falling apart, but he found the loose floorboards exactly where Samuel had said they would be. Hidden beneath them was a leather satchel containing nearly $10,000 and a letter. "A letter?" Penelope asked. Luke pulled it from his coat pocket, carefully unfolding the yellowed paper. "Samuel wrote it," he explained. "It is his confession. He explains how he robbed the bank alone, how he panicked when the bank manager recognized him and shot him. He wrote that he grabbed you in the saloon to tell you where the money was because he knew he was dying and wanted someone honest to find it and return it. He never meant to implicate you in anything." Penelope read the letter, written in a shaky hand, and tears filled her eyes. Samuel had tried to do the right thing in the end, even if it had gone terribly wrong. "There is more," Luke said. "I went to see Deputy Morrison. He is sheriff now. Coleman retired 6 months ago. Morrison was not part of the original posse, was not as convinced of your guilt. When I showed him the letter and the money, explained everything, he agreed to bring it before a judge. Penny, your name can be cleared. We can go home." "Home," Penelope repeated, testing the word. Valentine had not felt like home in a very long time. But having her name cleared, being able to live openly as herself, that was worth more than anything. They traveled back to Nebraska as a family, taking their time. When they reached Valentine in October of 1883, more than a year after fleeing, the town looked both familiar and strange. Penelope held Thomas close as they rode down the main street, acutely aware of the stares they were attracting. Sheriff Morrison met them at his office, and he was much more reasonable than Coleman had been. The proceedings took several weeks, with statements given and evidence examined. Judge Hawthorne, the same judge who had been coming to convict her that long ago dawn, listened to everything with a stern but fair expression. In the end, the verdict was clear. Penelope Hayes was innocent of all charges. Samuel Garrett's confession was deemed credible, and the return of the money spoke to her character. She was free, truly free, her name cleared and her record expunged. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the realization that she and Luke had lost nearly a year and a half to running and hiding. Time they could never get back. It was not lost, Luke said when she voiced this thought. They were standing on the porch of a small house they had rented in Valentine, watching Thomas toddle around the yard. "We fell in love. We got married. We had our son. Those things happened because of everything we went through, not in spite of it. I would not change a single moment, Penny." Penelope leaned against her husband, feeling the truth of his words. "You are right," she said. "And now we get to start the life we always dreamed of, for real this time." And that is exactly what they did. Luke got a job as foreman at a large ranch outside of Valentine, and he began saving toward buying their own land. Penelope worked for a while at the mercantile, where she was treated with respect and kindness. The town, once they understood the truth of what had happened, welcomed her back. 2 years after their exoneration, Luke and Penelope bought a parcel of land with a small house and a barn, just as Luke had always dreamed. It was not huge, but it was theirs, free and clear. They raised cattle and horses, and Luke proved to have a gift for breeding quality stock. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy with his father's green eyes and his mother's determination. When he was 4, he became a big brother to twin daughters, Emma and Rose. 2 years after that, another son, James, joined the family. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered, and the Emerson family became well respected in the community. Luke never forgot where he came from or what they had endured, and he made a point of helping others who were struggling or facing injustice. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Luke took Penelope back to the spot by the Platte River where he had first told her he loved her. The cottonwoods were golden again, and the air had that crisp autumn feeling. "Remember this place?" Luke asked, holding her hand. "How could I forget?" Penelope said, smiling up at him. "This is where you proposed, where everything began." "No," Luke said gently. "It began the night I opened that cell door, or maybe even before, from the moment I first saw you in the saloon and thought you had the kindest eyes I had ever seen." Penelope wrapped her arms around his waist. "We have had quite the adventure, haven not we?" "The best adventure," Luke agreed. "And it is not over yet. We have got a lot more years ahead of us, a lot more memories to make." He was right. They had decades more together, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own. Luke built his ranch into one of the most successful in the region, known for honest dealing and quality stock. Penelope became a pillar of the community, organizing charity events and helping new families settle in the area. On warm summer evenings, they would sit on their porch, much older but still deeply in love, and watch the sun set over their land. Their grandchildren would play in the yard, and the sounds of their laughter would fill the air. "You ever regret it?" Luke asked one such evening when they were both gray-haired and weathered by years of prairie sun. "Everything we went through, all the running and hiding." Penelope took his hand, her fingers still fitting perfectly between his. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You rode me out under cover of darkness when a posse was coming for me at first light, and you gave me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. You gave me love and family and a home. How could I regret any of it?" Luke raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you, Penny Emerson. I loved you then, I love you now, and I will love you until my last breath." "And beyond," Penelope added, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Love like ours does not end with death. It is eternal." They sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built a lifetime of light. The posse had been coming for her at first light all those years ago, but a cowboy had rode her out under cover of darkness, and in doing so, had saved them both. Years later, when they were both gone and their children were telling stories to the next generation, the tale of Luke and Penny Emerson became legend in that part of Nebraska. It was a story of courage and love, of sacrifice and redemption, of two people who refused to let injustice define them, and instead chose to define themselves. On the ranch they had built, which stayed in the Emerson family for generations, there was a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the land. Luke and Penny were buried there side by side, their headstones close enough that if you looked at them just right, they seemed to be leaning toward each other, even in death. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right through the cottonwoods they had planted, locals swore you could hear the sound of laughter and see two figures walking hand in hand through the golden light. Still together, still in love, their story eternal. Their great-granddaughter, a woman named Lucy who inherited Penny's kind eyes and Luke's determination, grew up hearing the stories. She learned about the night her great-grandfather risked everything to save an innocent woman from a vengeful posse. She learned about the months they spent running, about the birth of their first child in a mining town, about their eventual vindication and triumphant return home. But most importantly, she learned about the love that sustained them through it all. A love that started in a jail cell on the worst night of Penny's life and grew stronger with every challenge they faced together. A love that built a legacy lasting generations. Lucy would stand on the porch of the ranch house, the same one Luke had expanded over the years, and look out over the land, her great-grandparents had carved from the wild prairie. She would think about Penny serving drinks in a saloon, never imagining she would one day own hundreds of acres and raise a family in happiness and peace. She would think about Luke, a drifting cowboy carrying the weight of his father's murder, finding purpose and home in saving a woman he barely knew. The Wild West was not always a place of easy answers or clear justice. It was harsh and unforgiving, a land where you could die from a rattlesnake bite or a winter storm or the cruelty of other men. But it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, where love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, where second chances were possible if you were brave enough to seize them. Luke and Penny Emerson had been brave enough. And because they were, they not only survived but thrived, building a life that would be remembered long after the Wild West faded into history. On the anniversary of that long-ago night, when Luke opened Penny's cell door, the Emerson family would gather at the ranch for a celebration. They would eat and laugh and tell stories, and someone would always propose a toast to Luke and Penny, to the love that started it all. To Great-Grandpa Luke, they would say, raising their glasses, who rode out into the darkness without hesitation. To Great-Grandma Penny, they would continue, who trusted a stranger with her life and her heart. And to the love they found, they would finish together. May we all be so lucky. In the end, that was the real lesson of their story, not the dramatic rescue or the flight across the prairie or even the eventual justice. It was the love. The deep, abiding, unshakable love between two people who found each other when they both needed saving and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The Wild West was full of stories of outlaws and lawmen, of gunfights and cattle drives, of boom towns and ghost towns. But among all those stories, the tale of Luke and Penny Emerson stood out as something special. It was a reminder that even in the hardest of times, even when a posse was coming and darkness was falling, there was hope. There was love. There was the possibility of a cowboy riding to the rescue and changing two lives forever. Their story became the stuff of legend, passed down through generations, embellished perhaps in the telling but true in all the ways that mattered. It was told around campfires and in parlors, written down in family Bibles and county histories. It reminded people that love could conquer injustice, that courage could overcome fear, and that sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest futures. And so the story of how a posse came for Penelope Hayes at first light, and how a cowboy named Lucas Emerson rode her out under cover of darkness, lived on. It lived in the ranch they built, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they raised, in the land they loved, and in the hearts of everyone who heard their tale and believed in the power of love to transform lives. It was a story of the Wild West, yes, but more than that, it was a story of the wild human heart, of its capacity for courage in the face of danger, for hope in the midst of despair, and for love that burns bright enough to light even the darkest night. Luke and Penny found all of that in each other, and in doing so, they found everything that mattered. Their love story proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances, that heroes can appear when you least expect them, that love does not wait for convenient times or perfect situations. It arrives when it arrives, sudden as a summer storm and just as impossible to ignore. For Penny, standing in that jail cell with her whole life crumbling around her, love came in the form of a quiet cowboy with sad eyes and a brave heart. For Luke, drifting through life haunted by his father's murder, love came in the form of a frightened woman who reminded him why justice mattered. They saved each other that night in ways neither of them could have predicted, and they kept saving each other day after day, year after year, through every challenge and triumph until their last breaths and beyond. That was the legacy of Luke and Penny Emerson. Not just the successful ranch or the large family or the respected name. It was the love they shared and the example they set. It was the proof that even in the wild, lawless West, where survival was never guaranteed and justice was often elusive, love could still prevail. Love could still build something lasting and true. And on quiet evenings in Valentine, Nebraska, when the light slanted golden across the prairie and the wind whispered through the grass, you could almost see them still. Two figures on horseback, riding out under cover of darkness toward an uncertain future. But riding together, hand in hand, heart to heart, ready to face whatever came next, because that was what love did. It gave you the courage to ride into the darkness. It gave you someone to ride beside. And if you were very, very lucky, it gave you a story worth telling for generations to come. The posse had been coming for her at first light. A cowboy had rode her out under cover of darkness. And in doing so, they had written one of the greatest love stories the Wild West had ever known.